This week on Dig Me Out.
What was with the 90s and crows? Like the movie Crow and the Black Crows. And
Counting Crows.
Counting Crows. And
Sheryl Crow.
Sheryl Crow.
Tim and Jay review. Play with Love by Crow.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Dig Me Out. I'm your host, Tim Minichi, and joining me as always, my trusty, reliable co-host, Jason Siak. Jay, you're like the K-car of hosts.
Oh, jeez. I was afraid you were going to say Steed, but then you said K-car. Oh, boy.
I probably should go with Volvo. You're like the Volvo of hosts. Reliable.
K-car. You could rebadge me as anything.
Yeah.
He's a Renault. He's a Chrysler. He's a Dodge.
He's a Plymouth.
He's a Plymouth.
He's an AMC Eagle.
There you go. I'd like to be an AMC Eagle.
You know, it occurred to me, to completely derail this whole podcast, I forgot the fact that Chrysler had bought Jeep. That Jeep just wasn't always a part of Chrysler.
Yeah.
But they
AMC.
were their own separate, they were their own separate company. Chrysler got a hold of them, and they are what they are now. But that happened with a number of companies, car companies. I was doing some reading over the weekend, history of auto manufacturers and whatnot, and forgot, Pontiac started out as an independent car company, not as a part of GM.
Right. Somebody just wrote, who was it? Investment company. Just wrote something apparently about they foresee another huge consolidation in auto manufacturers coming soon. So even more of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure how much I buy into or where they're going with that, but could happen again, I guess.
Yeah. Let's get this back on track. Let's get to our requested review that we have this week.
Requested review.
From a car enthusiast. How about tying that together? Mr. Gavin Reed in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
He is fond of the motorized vehicle as we are, and he's also fond of a band called Crow and their 1998 album Play with Love. Now, Jay, were you familiar with the band Crow prior to Gavin introducing us to this?
Well, I want to say I was, just because that is like, I know we said this in the past, but that probably wins the award for most stereotypically 90s band name. What was with the 90s and crows? Like the movie Crow and the Black Crows and
Counting Crows.
Counting Crows and
Sheryl Crow.
Sheryl Crow. Was there some more crows?
There probably were.
So yeah, I feel like I've heard of this band, but no, I really haven't.
Well, there's probably a reason why, which is because there's almost no information on this band. If you go to Amazon.com and you look up their album, they have 0 reviews on Amazon.com, which is almost impossible to do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They don't have a page on AllMusic.com. They don't exist on AllMusic.com.
Huh. That's hard to do.
They have a small Wikipedia page, which is where I pulled most of the information about them off of. And I couldn't find really any reviews of this record. I found like the record label that released it was a small indie in Australia, and like 1 or 2 brief mentions. But when you try to Google Crow, believe it or not, you come up with a lot of information about crows.
Right.
Yeah. And then when you add Play with Love, the name of the album, or even the year of its release, 1998, you still really don't get any information. So this might be up there with one of the top 5 most obscure and least internet-friendly band names that we have encountered. So, there you go. But I did find out some information, Jay.
Yeah, let's piece this together.
And I can put it together in the history of the band.
History of the band.
The band was founded in 1986 in Sydney, Australia, by Peter Fenton on guitars and vocals, Peter's brother John on drums, and Peter Archer on lead guitar. So you have 2 Peters
Why weren't they called the Peters?
Yeah, that's a good question. And then the original bass player was Paul Gormack, but he quit the band or left the band just prior to their recording of their first album. So their first album was actually called My Kind of Pain. It was released in 1993. It was recorded in 1992 in Chicago, Illinois with Steve Albini. And it was released, it was released on Half a Cow Records in February 93. After those recording sessions, drummer John Fenton left the band. It was briefly replaced by Tina Stevens, and then after that, Andy Marks. And Andy Marks played drums on their next record, which was released on Ruart, which is a larger local label in Sydney, Australia. It was 1995. Liloing was the name of the album. At that point, Andy Marks, the drummer, left the band. He was replaced by Richard Andrew. Also, the following year, Peter Archer, founding member, lead guitarist, left the band and moved to Melbourne to start a family and pursue his own songwriting career. The band filled in his position with two people, Chris Abrams and Michael Christie, both on keyboards. And they appear on the album, which we're reviewing, Play with Love, which was released in 1998. The band separated shortly after that. However, in early 2000, they started rehearsing again for some shows. And in June of 2010, they released their album Arcane on Non-Zero Records. And that album features all four original members. Peter Archer on guitar and vocals, Peter Fenton on guitar and vocals, Jim Wolfe on bass, and, second bass player, Jim Wolfe, and then John Fenton on drums. And they're still, I guess, randomly playing shows. And then they also, some of the members have side projects that they work on as well.
Wait a minute. So how could a band that's been around that long and still be active have nothing?
Well, for this particular album, I could not find any information.
Okay.
But also, when I looked them up just in general on AllMusic, there was basically nothing there.
Being that they work with Steve Albini, you would think that would make it impossible.
Yeah. You think just by working with him, you automatically get a page on AllMusic, but...
Yeah.
I mean, for God's sake, our band has a page on AllMusic.
Right.
It's horribly wrong, but it's there.
Yeah.
It's lots of misinformation. But what are you going to do? So, if you want to suggest an album for us to review, feel free to visit our request a review page at digmeoutpodcast.com. If your album is obscure, please feel free to send us some information along with that album for that request. We did get some Facebook feedback, and it was, in fact, from Gavin Reed. He said, really looking forward to this. These guys went pretty much undiscovered, and I think they are back together. Probably only one song getting picked up on the radio from being huge, or at least seminal. I don't remember the album cover being so menacing. I don't know if the album cover is menacing per se, but it has a darkness to it. We'll get into the sense of darkness or menacing as we get into this record. Let's do a what I liked, what I didn't like about this record, Jay. I'm going to start out with you. Tell me one thing. What was the first thing that you liked when you listened to this record?
Bass tone.
Yeah.
Track 1, really cool, like grindy kind of bass, but also very melodic, at least for that track. And overall, I liked the sound of the band. I liked the combination of instruments for the most part. Heavy effects on the guitars and a lot of delay, so they're a little bit more distant and atmospheric, but the bass would typically have this tone through most of the record. Sometimes it would get a little bit cleaner. So I mean, just sonically, I was drawn into the band pretty quickly.
I'm gonna agree with you there. That the bass tone that opens up on a Broken Machine, along with there's some cool synth stuff that goes on, reminded me a lot of, and this is gonna come up often, a lot of Girls Against Boys.
Yeah.
Even the way he sings reminds me of that band. Just has that sort of dark, gravelly, deep. I think you referred to when we were going through the Girls Against Boys album, sort of a drunken lounge singer, sort of.
Yeah.
Or maybe that was me. I don't remember. But it has that. It's in that same sort of space, and it's this song in particular. There's a couple other songs that really get into that same space as well, but this song in particular reminded me a lot of that band and that sort of evil darkness. That sounds. It's like the soundtrack. I think you said. I know what you said. You said it was like soundtrack for the apocalypse. That's what it was.
Okay, take that.
Yeah, you can take that.
That band came to mind quite a bit. I think their potential could be potentially a more melodic version of that band, I guess, or a more melodic take on that style of rock. I think there's times where the vocal goes in some other directions on the record.
Yep.
To varying levels of success. Sometimes I like it, and sometimes not so much. I guess I do like when he is more vocally pronounced and sort of up front, or in the case of like Broken Machine, where it's, there's a melody there and it's in there, but it's not like so ridiculously distant or affected that you can't even tell what's going on, which there's a couple tracks where that happens.
Let me give you one of the things that I liked about this band. When I talked about the sort of the history of the band, I mentioned that the original guitar player, Peter Archer, had left, and they added 2 keyboard players, Chris Abrams and Michael Christie. And I think that, I don't know what those earlier albums sound like, and I don't know if there's just a lack of keyboards on those records, and if it was more guitar driven or whatnot. I can only go based on this record. But I like what they add, what they bring. They're using a lot of different sounds. Sometimes there's like an organ, like I mentioned in the first track. There's this kind of cool synth part going on. There's some very orchestral sounding piano parts where they like sweep up and down the keyboard in sort of dramatic ways. There's a lot of cool little parts that aren't necessarily in the forefront, but you can hear them sort of mixed into the background, whether it's like a Hammond organ sound or some sort of synth or whatever. But they always add like some interesting textures to the tracks that I think if this band, I think if you took those out and you did it with another guitar, it might sound, I don't know, a little more generic. And I think them adding those keyboard parts makes it sound a little more distinct.
You charge me with rising notions and tie me to the moon by octaves, and bruising a bleeding vacuum. Do you know what to do? The ringing, my instinct calling, crude talons, clear tide of contempt. Let it smile fall like sunlight on me. I wonder, do you ever know when you face me? You hate me. You face me.
Yeah, I would agree. I guess I can segue this into what I don't like, though. I think there is some interesting use of keyboards on here, piano specifically. There's also some parts where the music gets almost like jazzy, which isn't great. And then for them, and then when you can combine in the keyboards into some of those parts or near some of those parts, it takes on a whole other mood that I just don't think works on these guys at all. So Animal Husbandry, kind of starts with this jazzy guitar intro, which is really weird. I'm trying to see my notes here. There's a couple others where they it's Swollen Venus. You kind of do like a jazz guitar samba thing.
There's like a samba going on, yeah.
And it kind of like that's the point in the record where I started to hear like a ton of like alternative British music influences like buried down deep inside this band. So like when I heard that song, I'm like, oh, this kind of sounds like Pulp. Like I could hear them doing this, but like with way like better lyrics, you know, which would help pull that kind of thing off, and just a different attitude that would make a song like that work that this band just didn't have. And then as I gave it another listen, I was hearing more and more of like influences of bands like that, or at least similarities, whether they're influenced or not, to the point where I felt like the whole middle of the record and towards the end, basically from track, say 6, almost out through 12, I heard a lot of like middle era Radiohead, which I didn't really, I wouldn't have thought that, you know, based on the first half of the record, that was gonna happen. And in those songs, that piano, there's at times it's interesting, but there's other times where it's just like it's an identity problem for this band, you know, like where are they going? What are they trying to do here? You know, it's borderline experimental, but then it's also borderline like, I don't know, jazzy alternative music or something. It's just like, or a Radiohead light, or some kind of like Britpop light, or just all of these other kinds of things that I just don't think this band's particularly good at pulling off.
Suppose you're wondering why I called you here. Get everyone together from every room. They see your wonderful faces, all drinks in them. And spend the time right here, laughing the whole day through. Not help all of you if you have too much to give. You have an instant rally ahead, the valley of love. You got a slow Venus here amongst us right now.
I struggle with that aspect of the band and in general the keyboard things. I think that there's times, I agree, where it's totally a unique element and makes them sound different and can do some pretty cool stuff. And then there's other parts where it just adds to the already confusing identity of what this band's trying to be.
Yeah, and also moving into what I didn't necessarily like. I think I can hear where you're coming from with regards to the keyboard part. I think those are what save it in what I think are a lot of really weak songs where they don't really ever find a chorus.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of like Head On, Feet Off, which is a little bit of more of it's a different space for them because it's a distorted vocal and it's up tempo. There's not really there's nothing really to grab onto. It's just a sort of like a collection of parts, and that happens quite a bit. They go to a 3/4 or 6/8 depending on however you want to count it off. But they go to this swing beat a lot on the record.
Yeah.
And anybody who's ever played that beat knows once you get into it, it's really hard to get out of it and like figure out something else to do.
Yeah.
So once you get into that swing, it's like, unless you can come up with something, if you play that for 4.5 minutes, that's going to get real boring. Now, I will give them credit because they do keep the songs relatively tight for the most part.
Yeah.
There's only, all these songs are under 4 minutes except for 3 of them, and 2 of them are pretty close. The one that goes well over is track 7, Whatever Does Connect Us, which is really annoying. Sounds like a bad attempt at like a Nick Cave song combined with a Muse B-side.
Yeah.
It's just this loungy spoken word part with some weirdness, and then there's these like backwards, parts, and that specter of Nick Cave. I don't know how much Nick Cave you've listened to, Jay, but it hangs over a lot of this record. Yeah, like very dark, foreboding, singing songs about misconduct I would say it would be a word I would use, but bad behavior and that sort of, not that they're copying his whole like attitude and vocal delivery or anything like that, but just like I kept thinking, they're both from Australia, so it just kept sort of popping in my head. And you mentioned the Radiohead stuff, which makes sense because this is 97, but that like second tier Radiohead just reminds me of like that like early sort of like Muse B-sides when they're sort of like working out where they're going as a band.
Yeah, and they don't have the songwriting chops that either of those two bands have.
No.
So, you end up with a song like Bobby Pin, which I think works in a lot of ways, and in other ways it doesn't. So I like the sound of that song. I like the verse. I actually like the intro, which a lot of these songs that have intros on them I don't like. And they do this thing where they reprise the intro, and the intro is kind of like this build. Like it builds all this tension, but it literally goes nowhere.
Right.
So halfway through the song, I'm like, wait a minute, they're not going anywhere with this. Like they just keep playing this part, and it's like a build to nothing. Kind of noodle over it at one part, and then at one point, and then I think what you were saying about the swing thing, like they don't know how to get out of it. Like they create a part in with a particular kind of dynamic that they just don't know how to, from a songwriting standpoint, pivot out of. You hear it in Press on Let Go. It's got this bluesy kind of swagger that's kind of nice, and then out of nowhere they go into this like this weird like stomp. Like they totally change up the rhythm, and it gets real noisy and disjointed. And from with some standpoint, I'm like, okay, you just, that's one way to deal with it. Like you just almost do like a progressive rock kind of like tempo shifts, time signature change,
right?
Just go into something completely different. You just force it. But that part, I think I would like it better if it actually had some kind of resolve to it, like it made it to a really compelling chorus, but it doesn't. They do the pivot, and I buy into it, but they just don't have the follow through on a lot of this stuff. So you kind of just end up with, I think in most cases, an intro verse, then they go back to the intro, and then they kind of stumble through some semblance of some kind of chorus, and then they go back to the verse. It doesn't sound, from a songwriting standpoint, very well developed at all. I think from a sound standpoint, they've got some cool stuff going on. They just don't have the material ready to kind of wrap it around.
Yeah, and then when you get towards the end of the record, they actually sort of pick up the tempo a little bit after sort of middling, sort of mid-tempo stuff in the middle. Plagiarize has a kind of a Nirvana, early Incesticide, Bleach sort of Nirvana sound. With more not guided by voices, Girls Against Boys, influence, and then,
I like that on that song too. And I agree with those comparisons. I also just like that. I think it's the only song on the record where the vocal is like right up front and like immediately there. It was just refreshing to not sit through a minute and a half intro before you hear a vocal, and also not have the vocal like pushed far back in the mix. And
then that song sort of pairs well with the last song, Throwaway, which is Actually, it's a nice change of pace in that it is the shortest song on the record, and it's the last song, and there's no stupid track after it, and it's up tempo, which most bands in the 90s, when they were getting to track 12, were doing their 7-minute long, slow song. So I appreciated that, and it's it is kind of a throwaway, but it is a decent short little rock song.
Yeah, I thought it was probably one of the better written songs on the record. Like, just in terms of, maybe this. I'm not quite sure if this band is trying to write a pop format or not. And at least in this song, you're like, okay, I get what they're doing here. Like, it's fairly predictable, but it's well done. And some of the other stuff where they don't fully commit to being experimental, and they don't fully commit to writing a pop song, and you're like, all right, what are you doing here? Like, you're just wandering in this no man's land. That song is, it's concise. It makes sense. The dynamics they try to, that they attempt, and they actually are pretty successful. That they pull it down a little bit in the chorus, and it makes sense why they do that, and kind of go somewhere. And so I would like this record to have more material like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Gavin had said that they were, one song away from being huge if they got picked up by radio, but I don't really hear this as a radio band unless they completely overhauled the songwriting, because there's just, I don't know where your pop hook is in terms of any of these songs. Now, you don't necessarily need that in 1994, but 97, I think you kind of do. I don't think you're getting on the radio sounding like this in 1997.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing on this record that maybe throwaway, I don't know. But there's nothing on this record I could hear for that time period having a strong enough hook to work. I mean, like I said a couple times already, they have a unique enough sound and an interesting enough sound that if they stumbled into some material, somewhere, they probably, it's not that the sound of the band isn't, relevant for this time period. It's just the type of music, not the type of music, the songwriting is just not up to par of what I would think, at least in the U.S. Now, maybe Australian radio at that time was a little bit different, but at least in the U.S., there's not enough here.
No.
Even with the Radiohead type stuff on the record, you could, obviously that would have worked because, Radiohead's stuff worked a couple years before, and then there was a ton of bands after that it worked for. They just do it without this sense of songwriting.
Right. And you can tell that they're, trying to get there. If you take a song like track 3, Hate Need, which is, it's a slower song, it's okay. And then when they get to the chorus, they kind of elevate the song. They take it into a different, take it to a higher level, but it's just, the vocal's not very interesting.
Yeah.
Like, the music rises up, and the vocal's just not there to sort of match it.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, a guy like Tom York, he, at that time of, say, the Bends, knew how to make that chorus really soar. And unfortunately, this band doesn't quite have that as a tool in their kit, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you're keeping the music really interesting on every song, they're not necessarily doing that. No,
they do, like you mentioned earlier, they do make the good call of keeping this stuff pretty concise. So I could see spending a little bit of time with this, connecting with it and actually kind of enjoying quite a bit, just based on the length of the songs. You're not in for there's one 6-minute song, but you're not in for a bunch of 5 and 6 minute songs.
No.
For the most part, you're done in 3.5 minutes or 3 minutes. So they go about it that way in terms of being brief and concise. But it's just the songwriting is not within those small time frames is not as strong as it could be.
So Jay, if you were to rate this record, worthy album, better EP, decent single, where is Play With Love by Crow?
I'm at an EP. I have Broken Machine, Bobby Pin, Plagiarize, Throw Away. I could probably throw on something like Press On, Let Go. And, I tend to like the stuff that was more in the vein of, I guess, Girls Against Boys. And yeah, I like a little bit of the Radiohead melodrama, but just when they touch on it, like combining that with the Girls Against Boys is kind of an interesting, mix to go about trying to pull off. So, I'm at about 4 or 5 songs.
Yeah, I'm about there with you. I'm at 3 strong songs, and then I could probably add 1 or 2 more as towards the end of that EP. But a worthy album I cannot abide. So we're gonna have to go with an EP here. Unfortunately, that might break Gavin's streak. I think we had quite a few records that we really liked in terms of giving a worthy album to. So we'll have to come back with a sure winner next time.
Everybody strikes out every now and then.
It's true. This is more of a foul tip. This is a one that it has some potential. It has some elements, not quite as cohesive or as doesn't come together. Let's put it that way. It doesn't come together the way it should.
I gotta say, I was pretty excited when I put on the first track.
Yes.
As that first song kicks in, I thought, I was going to be in for something I really was going to enjoy. And then, right with track 2, that guitar intro on the second track, I'm thinking, what in the world?
Well, it's almost a blues riff. Like it's
where
like
is this band going?
Stevie Ray Vaughan riff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then when you get to track 4, you're just completely lost. You're like, what is this samba? This just turned into a Beck record.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
So that's a couple of better EPs for myself and Jay on Crow's Play With Love. If you have an opinion on this record, please leave us some feedback on our Facebook page or over at digmeoutpodcast.com on our discuss thread. Of course, if you like what you heard, you can leave us some positive feedback over at our iTunes page. I want to thank everybody for listening to the podcast, checking us out, whether it's on Radio.io, Stitcher, through our iTunes, or Podbean streaming or download. We greatly appreciate it and want to recommend that you head on over to digmeoutpodcast.com for our weekly posts that you can enjoy, our news of the week, our previews, and what do we call them on preview Friday previews, and the Monday videos of the bands that we're going to be reviewing. So I don't even remember if this one is either a live. This has got to be a live performance. I can't remember if this band actually had a video to go along with this record, but sometimes the live videos are even better than the videos. You get a little time capsule from the late or mid 90s of these bands, which is pretty interesting. So I think that's it. We are out. We'll be back again next week with a very special episode. You'll have to tune in to find out what that's going to be about, of Dig Me Out.
Join the conversation about this episode at digmeoutpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Facebook page and Twitter feed, as well as links to our Request a Review and merchandise pages.